We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Gimel Amid Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 23b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought the opinion of Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama disagreed with the Ziknei Dorim, the elders of the south. And Rami Bar Chama said on the previous summit, let's say you had an individual who was Tamei Meis, and so he would not be able to eat the carbon Pesach. Really, he's supposed to do Pesach Sheni, but let's say he sends his carbon anyway, and he sends that animal to be a carbon Pesach. So if they bring that animal on his behalf, would we say that B'diavad, after the fact, even though he's not able to eat from it, still it would be accepted and he would not need to do Pesach Sheni? Or do we say no, the requirement that he be able to eat from the carbon is an absolute requirement, and therefore this carbon Pesach does not fulfill his requirement, he has to bring the Pesach Sheni? And Rami Bar Chama said that the carbon would not be good in such a situation, meaning even after the fact if he sends the carbon, but if he was Tamei Meis, he could not partake, he could not eat from the carbon, that carbon would not be good, he would need a Pesach Sheni. And the Gemara now is asking on Rami Bar Chama from a Brisa. The Brisa says that the Pasuk says that the tzitz, it carries the burden of the avon hakadoshim, the sin of the kodshim. The implication of the pasuk is there's some kind of possible disqualification by a carbon, and the tzitz is maratza. The tzitz allows that carbon is accepted. And the Brisa wants to clarify what exactly is wrong with the carbon. And so the Brisa now continues and says, im avon pigul. If you're going to say that the Brisa is talking about the sin of pigul, Rashi will explain what these terms mean in this context. But if you're going to say it's the sin of pigul generally means that a person has a thought when he's doing the avod of the carbon, he has a thought that the carbon is either going to be consumed not at the proper time, or the carbon is going to be consumed not in the proper place. But if that's what we're talking about, harei kvar nemar lo yechashev, it already says lo yechashev, which means it's not accepted. And im avon noser, if it's the sin of noser, which again technically means here that the part of the carbon was left over, not eaten in the proper time. Rashi's going to say that is not what it means. But in any case, if it means the sin of noser, harei kvar nemar lo yeratz, it says that's not accepted either. So what are we talking about? Ha'eno nose elo avon tuma shehutra michlala b'tzibor. So what the burden, the sin that's being carried over here, the burden of sin that's being carried and the carbon that is being accepted is the sin of tuma, which is permitted when you have a situation of tuma b'tzibor. And so therefore over here we're saying that in biyachid, in a situation where it's a private individual, the carbon will be accepted after the fact. And the Gemara continues its proof against Rami Bar Chama. Now, my tumah, what tumah exactly are we talking about? Ileima tumas sheretz. If you say we're talking about tumas sheretz, so heicha ishtri, where do we ever find that tumas sheretz is permitted b'tzibur? We don't find that. That's something that you find specifically by Tamei Meis. Let's say most of the majority of the community is Tamei Meis by Karban Pesach, so we find that the tumah is hutra b'tzibur, but we don't find that by tumas sheretz. So ella tumas meis, rather we must be talking about tumas meis, since that is permitted again b'tzibur. So here we're going to say that b'diavad, the carbon of the individual will be accepted. V'lav kagon shenitmu bailim b'meis. Isn't the situation over here where the owners became tamei meis exactly the situation which Rami Bar Chama is talking about? Almun nitmu bailim b'meis. And what do you see? You see that if the bailim become tamei meis, mishalchen karbonosei, and then if they send their karbonos again by carbon pesach, it would be b'diavad. That carbon is going to be accepted. That's exactly what the Brisa is saying against Rami Bar Chama. The Gemara continues, uvamai, what particular carbon are we talking about? Ibn Nazir, if we're talking about Nazir, that cannot be. V'chiyamos meis olav amar achmana. The pasuk talks about a Nazir becoming tamei and goes through exactly the process. He brings certain karbonos betuma, and then he starts over his count, and then he brings certain karbonos betara. So we're certainly not talking about that. Ela la'osa pesach. Rather, we're talking about again exactly our case, a carbon pesach, and it seems to be saying meshalchin karbonos, saying that the carbon will be accepted b'diavad. And so therefore, this is a question on Rami Bar Chama, and the Gemara continues and answers liolam b'sheretz. No, really, we are talking about tumas sheretz. We are not talking about tamei meis over here, and we're saying that by tumas sheretz, it's going to be accepted, and that we actually did say that Rami Bar Chama would agree to. And so then the only question is, well, what's the meaning of the Brisa? It's tumah that's hutra mechlala b'tzibor. Tumas sheretz is not permitted b'tzibor. Let's say you have rove of the tzibor having tumas sheretz, that would not permit the karbonos to be brought. It's only a din by tamei meis. But the Gemara answers, v'shem tumah b'olam. The Brisa simply means tumah in general is permitted b'tzibor. This particular tumas sheretz, is not permitted b'tzibor. But since in general tumah is permitted b'tzibor, therefore the tumas sheretz, we say again, meshalchin karbonosehen. That's how Rami Bar Chama will explain this Brisa. And Rashi explains, im avon pigul, if we're talking about the sin of pigul, harei kvar nemar lo yeratz, it says already that won't be accepted. Vim avon noser, and the sin of noser, harei kvar nemar lo yechashev, also that will not be accepted. And Rashi says, Hachi Garsin Allah b'Toras Kohanim, this is the proper text and the text that we have in Toras Kohanim, V'chein Hatza'asa b'chol makom. This should be the proper text in all situations. The text that Rashi over here is referring to is that by Pigul, the pasuk is Lo Yeratza. This is not the girsa that we have. We actually have Lo Yechashev by Pigul. And then by Noser, the proper text should be Lo Yechashev. And again, we have by Noser Lo Yeratza, so we have it reversed. And so Rashi is giving us the proper girsa. V'hachi kamar, and here's how you interpret the brisa. Eza psul carbon meratzehu, which disqualification of a carbon is the tzitz being meratze and allowing that carbon. Im avon pigul, if you're talking about the sin of pigul, Rashi understands that to mean the machsheves chutz lemekomo. That's an intention to consume the carbon outside of the proper place. That is considered pigul. It's not a case where you get kares in that situation. That's not a pigul of kares, but it is a situation of pigul. The ikri pigul, that's called pigul. Kid amar lekamon b'pirkan, like we say later on in our perek. Pigul hu lo yeratza. If again you have the wrong machshav in terms of makom, that's considered pigul. It's not accepted. Emeino inyan lechutz lizmano. And we say over there that if it's not talking about chutz lizmano, so tenei inyan chutz lemekomo. It's talking about chutz lemekomo. Harek varnemar lo yeratza. It says lo yeratza. So that's one thing we're talking about when we say pigul over here. We're talking about a machsheves, a thought, an intention of chutz lemekomo. And imavo noser, if we're talking about the sin of noser, Rashi here also explains it doesn't mean actual noser. It means psul machsheves noser. That's a disqualification of an intention of leaving it past the proper time. Shechishev lo ochlo la'achar shenasa noser. He thinks to eat it after it will be noser. Dahainu machsheves chutz lizmano. That is an intention of chutz lizmano. Harek varnemar hamakriv also lo yechoshev. It says for that lo yechoshev, that also is not accepted. V'haikra b'chutz lizmano misukma b'pirkan. This pasuk we say in our perek is talking about chutz lizmano. Rashi notes the other girsa. V'svarim shalanu girsa zu meshabashas. In our svarim, the girsa is mixed up. B'chol makom b'hashas everywhere. U'machlifin hamikros. The psukim are switched around. U'la'osa hagirsa einoch yochol lefarish noser zeh b'machsheves chutz lizmano. According to this wrong girsa, you can't say the noser is talking about chutz lizmano. V'hapigol b'machsheves chutz lemekomo, and say pigul is talking about machsheves chutz lemekomo. To lo yechashev b'chutz lizmano ksiv, because lo yechashev is written by chutz lizmano. V'tzarchat lefarish noser mamish, and then you're going to need to explain the brisa. It's talking about actual noser. It's not talking about an intention. It's talking about actual leftover, when you left over the meat. V'yav shalomar came, but you can't say that. She'ein ha-karbon shekirva matira b'achsher. It's simply not true. A carbon where the matir is brought properly, that it does not become nifsal. The carbon doesn't become disqualified milaratzos from being accepted, velalos l'shem choven, fulfilling the obligation im hoser mimenu, just because you ended up leaving over. And so therefore you cannot possibly explain. We're talking about noser, says Rashi, and that's why Rashi explains as he explains. And in any case, the brisa goes on and says, ha'eno nosei, ha'kelomar hine motzinu she'eno nosei ela avon hatuma. What is the tzitz being meratza for? What burden of sin is it carrying? It's talking about the sin of tuma. V'yesh tam l'davar, and the brisa tells us there's a logic to this. There's a reason. Litei nesias psul kachem zal tuma, to say we're talking about tuma. Ha'olu matzino la heter acher, u'matzino la heter acher. We find another case where tuma is permitted. Shehutra michlala b'tzibor lechatchila. Again, you have a situation of tuma sibor. It's mutter lechatchila. Hilkach yachid shelo hutra etzlo yavo hatzitz v'yirtze b'diavad. Therefore, for an individual where we don't say that tuma is mutter, but still the tzitz can be meratze b'diavad. And so then the Gemara goes on and clarifies what exact tumah, what exact carbon. Ilema tumas sheretz. If you say we're talking about tumas sheretz, misukma bekohen or bebailim, we're talking by the kohen or the bailim. The Shinuya Nischas discusses whether the girsa of bekohen should be here or not. But in any case, if you're talking about the tumah of the bailim, ulameimar dehai deshochet v'zorek al tamei sheretz tzitz hu demaratze, and then you're going to say that when it says shochet v'zorek, it's talking about tamei sheretz, and we're saying that the tzitz is maratze, but that's not true. Where do we find that tumas sheretz is going to be permitted b'tzibur? We don't say it's permitted b'tzibur. Kevon de'ein yochid nidche, because again, an individual by tumas sheretz, since he's able to eat it that night, tumas sheretz is just that day tumah, and he can purify himself. So since the individual is not pushed off, that's what we said earlier. Tzibur lo avdi b'tumah. By tumas sheretz, the tzibur is not able to bring the carbon b'tumah because the yochid actually is not pushed off. You're able to slaughter and throw the blood on behalf of someone who is tamei sheretz. And so Rashi continues, instead the Gemara said, Lav kagon shenitmu bailim b'meis. Isn't it talking about tumas meis for the owners of the carbon? Bitmiya, this is all part of the question. Umilo mairi, b'tumas bailim. We're talking about tumas bailim. V'kotani mishalchen, and it says that the owner, even though he's tummy, is able to send the carbon, b'di'evet, it will be accepted. And that would be, again, a question, if we're talking about carbon pesach, as we're about to say, that would be a question on Rami Bar Chama. The Gemara said we can't be talking about a nazir's carbon, because v'chiyamus meis olav amar achmana. The pasuk talks about what happens happens by Tumah there? The Tameh Rosh Nizro V'Soser, it undoes his whole count of Nazirus, Ve'in Roy LeKarbanos Tahara, and he's not even able to bring the Karbanos Tahara, Ad Sheyavru Yemei Tumah, until all the days of Tumah are finished. V'Yavi Kaparas Tumas Nazirus, so he brings the atonement for the Tumah, Shtei Torah and V'Yasham, he brings the 2 Torah and the Yasham, V'Yimnen, then he counts again, V'Yashlam V'Yavi, Karbanos Tagalachto, and then he's going to bring his other Karbanos. And Rashi continues, then the Gemara said, Ela Bo'osa Pesach, rather we're talking about somebody who's bringing Karban Pesach, Ushma Mina, and again we see from there, or we see from this Brisa, Tamei Meis Meshaleach Pischo, that the Tamei Meis could send his Karban Pesach and it will be accepted, V'kasha l'Rami Bar Chama, and that's difficult to Rami Bar Chama. And then the Gemara said, no, Liolam Tomas Sheretz Kamrin, and maybe really the Brisa is talking about Tomas Sheretz, Me'achad, that sits Meratza Lishchad V'Lizrok al Tamei Sheretz, again that sits allows, it will be accepted by Tamei Sheretz, you can slaughter and throw the blood for a Tamei Sheretz, with the Kasha l'Chechesh Daroi Behen, and the question was, where do we find that that's permitted, but Tzibor, that kind of Tumah, V'shem Tumah B'olam, it just means in general we say that Tumah is permitted. Ashkechondish Daroi Behen, we find that there is a permission by Tumah for the Tzibor, V'taima Godol Bu Lahatil Ritzoy Tzitz al Tumah Sheretz, so it makes sense to say that the Ritzoy Tzitz, the acceptance based on the Tzitz, can be talking about a situation of Tumas Sheretz. And the Gemara continues, V'ika d'dayiku ma'isi hachi, there are those who draw an inference from the Brisa, and they bring the Brisa as follows. Now, in this version, the Brisa is actually going to be a question not on Rami Bar Chama, but on the Ziknei Dorim, on the elders of the south, and it's going to be a question on 2 things that the Ziknei Dorim said. First of all, the Ziknei Dorim said that a Tamei Meis, somebody who is Tamei Meis with regards to Karban Pesach, is in fact allowed to send the carbon, even though he will not partake of the carbon. He won't eat from the carbon. That's not an absolute requirement, and therefore if he sends the carbon, it will be accepted b'di'evid. He shouldn't do that lechatchila, because really he should be doing Pesach Sheni, but again, b'di'evid, according to the Ziknei Dorim, it is accepted. And additionally, the Ziknei Dorim also said, with regards to our Mishnah, let's say you have a Kohen who's Tameh, it says that if he does the Avoda, then that Avoda is disqualified. The Ziknei Dorim said that's talking specifically about Tumas Sheretz, but if the Kohen is Tamei Meis, then actually it is not disqualified. That is the second thing that the Ziknei Dorim said. And so some infer from the Brisa against both of those points of the Ziknei Dorim. And they say as follows, Avon HaKadoshim in, that when the Brisa says that the tzitz is meratza, that it carries the burden of the sin, it's talking about a sin that is relevant to the carbon itself. But Avon Makdishin lo, but we're not talking about a sin that's relevant to the Makdishin, meaning to the people bringing to the carbon, whether it be the owners, whether it be the Kohen, that sin is not carried. Now, my tumah, now if that's the case, what kind of tumah are we talking about? Meaning, what kind of tumah of the makdishin is not being accepted? Ilema tumas sheretz. If you say we're talking in this brisa about tumas sheretz, so miyashtarya b'tzibur, the same question. It's saying in the brisa that this is some kind of tumah that's permitted b'tzibur, but as we said, tumas sheretz is not permitted b'tzibur. Elolav tumas meis, rather is it not tumas meis? V'avon kadashim in, and it's bearing the sin of the kadshim, but avon makdishim lo. But if the makdishim are tamei meis, so then apparently it's not going to carry the sin. It will not carry the burden of that sin. And again, that's a question against both points of the Ziknei Dorim, because we're saying avon makdishim lo. It doesn't matter if it's the kohen that's tamei. It doesn't matter if it's the bailam that's tamei. The carbon is not going to be accepted. And the Ziknei Dorim said the opposite. The Ziknei Dorim said that if the kohen is tamei, then we say if it's tumas meis, the carbon still will be accepted. And also if the owners by carbon pesach are tamei, if they send the carbon, even though they cannot eat from the carbon, still it will be accepted. So that's a question on the Ziknei Dorim, and the Gemara ends up with the same answer. Lo no, liolam tumas sheretz. It could be that the Brisa is talking about tumas sheretz, v'shem tuma biolam. And again, the Brisa just means tuma in general is permitted b'tzibur. It doesn't mean that tumas sheretz is permitted b'tzibur. Rashi explains, v'ika d'dayik, some infer, lishna dekroi, they infer from the language of the psukim. U'maisin l'hachtiyuvta de Brisa l'Ziknei Dorim, they bring this Brisa against the Ziknei Dorim, v'seyata l'Rami Bar Chama. It's actually a proof to Rami Bar Chama. Avon makdishim lo, because they infer that the sin of those who are bringing the carbon were not permitting, meaning tumas haguf, meaning if there's tuma on the people who are bringing the carbon as opposed to the carbon, bein de kohanim, bein de bailam lo meratza, whether the kohanim or the owners, it will not be accepted. B'mai tuma koy de kamei tumas haguf. What tuma are we talking about where we're excluding this tumas haguf? Ilema tumas sheretz. If you say tumas sheretz, v'nukma Ziknei Dorim. Now, if it's tumas sheretz, then the elders of the south could say that what are we talking about over here? B'kohen. We're talking about tumas sheretz of the kohen. That's not accepted. The ilu guf de bailam, because the tumas sheretz actually of the owners, lo boy tzitz, that you don't even need the tzitz. Sharei ein nogea botuma ula orsa b'tara, because it's not an issue, because he's going to be tar in the evening anyway, and achale, he'll be able to eat it in the evening, as we've already said. So we'd be talking only about the kohen if it's tumas sheretz, but still that doesn't work. Heicha ishtar roy b'tzibur, but where do we find tumas sheretz permitted by b'tzibur? Hakevan di islu shochten v'zorken al tamei sheretz, since they hold that we can slaughter and we can throw the blood for tamei sheretz. V'yachid ein nidche tzibur lo avdi b'tumah. So again, since the yachid is not pushed off when it comes to tumas sheretz, as we just said, so the tzibur doesn't. They're not permitted to bring it b'tumah. So we can't be talking about tumas sheretz. Elo lav tumas meis. Rather, aren't we talking about tumas meis? She'eno mishalech karbonos, that he cannot send the carbon. V'lo kohen tamei meis meratza b'karbon yachid, and a kohen who's tamei meis, the carbon is not accepted. Again, both of those points go against the ziknei darim. And then the Gemara answered, Liolam b'tumas sheretz. Really, we're talking about tumas sheretz. Koi, that's what we're talking about. V'kamen mayit kohen tamei sheretz milaratzos, and we're talking about a kohen tamei. If he's tamei sheretz, we're saying that it will not be accepted. K'de'ukmei ziknei darim p'sul d'mas nisan, which is exactly how the elders of the South interpreted the disqualification of our Mishnah by a kohen tamei that's going on tamei sheretz. That's going on a tamei sheretz. And again, Rashi reiterates, v'tumas bailam ein tzrichin tzitz. If the bailam are tamei in terms of tumas sheretz, they don't even need the tzitz. Sharei carbon b'tahara karav, because that's already a situation where the carbon's being brought b'tahara. The owners are just sending the carbon, someone else is bringing it, and then by the time it's eaten anyway, they will be pure. And the question was, where do we find that tumas sheretz is permitted b'tzibur? We just mean tumah in general is permitted b'tzibur. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yoshev, if a kohen is sitting, so then the carbon is not accepted. Minolan, from where do we know this? Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Rava says that Rav Nachman says, Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, La'amod l'sharis, it says to stand and serve. La'amida bechartiv v'lo liyeshiva. I chose him to stand and not to sit. The Gemara continues, Tanu Rabban, the rabbis taught, La'amod l'sharis, to stand and to serve. Mitzvah, that just implies that it's a mitzvah l'chatchila. Doesn't mean the carbon is necessarily disqualified. Kishu Amar ha'omdim, but when it says ha'omdim, it repeats it. Shana olav hakasav liakev. The pasuk here is repeating it to say that it is in fact required, and if the kohen is sitting, the carbon will not be accepted. Amarle Rava Rav Nachman. Rava said to Rav Nachman, Michti, let us see. Yoshev kizor dami. If a kohen is sitting, he's like a non-kohen already. That's his status. Umachil avod, and we say the avod is profaned. We say the carbon is not accepted. So Ema, so why don't we say mazor b'misa? Just like a non-kohen has the death penalty. It's talking about the death penalty by heaven. Af Yoshev b'misa. So to the kohen who's sitting down, there should be the death penalty. Alam Tanya, why do we learn in a brisa? Aval orel onein yoshev einon b'misa elabas or. It says if you have an orel, a kohen who's uncircumcised, an onein, a kohen who's in a acute mourner, a yoshev, a kohen who's sitting down, they do not have the penalty of death. It's just a warning. And the Gemara answers to that, mishum dehave mechusar begadim v'shalo rachatz yadayim v'raglayim, because a kohen who's not wearing all of the garments, he's missing garments. Or let's say a kohen who didn't wash his hands and feet. Well, there we say there is that punishment of misa b'dei shamayim, but that's shnei ksuvin haboin ke'echad. Those are two psukim that teach the same thing, and we generally do not learn to other cases in situations of shnei ksuvin haboin ke'echad. We say the reason why it's repeated the second time is to say it's only in these two cases and not in other cases. And Rashi explains Lamod l'shares reisha dekra. The beginning of this pasuk is Kivo bachar Hashem Elokecha mikol shvatecha Lamod l'shares. It says you're chosen to stand and serve. Lo liyeshiva, not for sitting. V'kevan delo nivcharu, since you weren't chosen. Havel huzarim, that makes them like a non-kohen. That's exactly what we're talking about. The bechira means you're chosen as a kohen. So if you're sitting and you're not chosen, so you're like a zar, as the Gemara goes on to say. V'zar machel avoda. Zar, we say that the avoda is desecrated, it's profaned. Ha'omdim shama v'sheretz kachol echav halavim. It says ha'omdim sham. Again, right before that, it says that they're serving like he serves like all of his brethren. And ema mazar. And then the Gemara asked, we should say just like a zar v'nigmar b'mamatzino. We should learn through a mamatzino, just like we find by a zar. So too over here. Bezar shemechel avoda v'chayev misa. A zar desecrates the avoda, he's chayev misa. Af yoshev shemechel avoda b'misa. So too sitting, who desecrates the avoda is b'misa. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Dalid Amud Aleph.